Well, we'd like to welcome you all back to our weekly peer review, and this is going to be the last in our series on specifically EMDR as part of trauma-informed and capable care. Today we want to talk about EMDR from a multicultural, cross-cultural perspective. And I think we here in Hawaii are uniquely positioned to speak with some authority on that. Our community probably is one of the most culturally diverse communities on planet Earth if we use interracial marriage as a baseline. And we are also the most geographically remote place on planet Earth, all within 10 minutes of this particular setting that we're sitting in right now here in Friendship House. So I think we can speak to this pretty credibly. EMDR as a treatment modality really evolved out of really hard science, hard medical research, neurological research. And yet when we think of psychotherapy broadly, it's largely, it seems, historically been largely a European American phenomenon. And in the past, it's been largely available and embraced by pretty much white, upper class, European American people. And applying psychotherapy across the board has had limitations based on the fact that most of the psychotherapies that we've had have their own cultural view, and some of the limitations and criticisms of psychotherapy and its access to broader cultural groups has been that cultural point of view. It's been culturally centric, if you wish. And when we're dealing with a multicultural perspective, there's always, as social work looks at it, the dual cultural perspective. You're looking at the dominant culture and you're looking at the particular subculture and the world views and how the views are different. And they're different not only based on values, history, experience, but certainly language. Okay, so all those things play heavily into psychotherapy because you're using personal language, cultural values in exchange to do the therapeutic method. I think EMDR is uniquely positioned to transcend a lot of that. The first reason I think it can transcend a lot of it is that you don't have to talk about everything so much. And you can use minimal language, a minimal amount of language if need be, to do EMDR. The other thing is universally we all have the same brain and nervous system. We all have the same brain and nervous system. And trauma affects all of us neurologically the same way, regardless of culture. So you could argue that some cultures may have greater resilience, some may be less, who knows. But be that as it may, we have the same brain, the same nervous system, and we're all impacted the same way by trauma. It's a universal. EMDR needing minimal language makes it available to be used in a pretty simplistic way across cultures. Just a simple case example of this, I had an opportunity one time to work with a teenage boy, a Micronesian boy, Chukis. And I don't think he had maybe 5 words, English words, that he could use. And the family that he came with his family, if they had 10 English words, that we were probably lucky. And yet we were able to do a successful EMDR session. He had been involved in an altercation at school, a fight. It involved the legal system. The boy felt very confused and threatened. It was a pretty traumatic event for the boy. But we were able to do a complete EMDR session with simple use of ideographs as to structure the EMDR therapy. And I'll show some slides here of what this looks like. We have a simple, tray that we use that have symbols for, the the degree of distress, 0 to 10, and we have a simple tray for the belief of the cognition, the change in the cognition, a thumbs up, thumbs down, and a number scale. But these use of simple symbols are a way to get across that language barrier. The other thing is that by very much like as we do with children, getting the client, the person, to make a drawing, a representation of what happened to them, embeds in it the worst parts of it. So you don't have to actually go through all the struggle to find what's the very worst image, because it's embedded in the picture itself. And so by simply adjusting the protocol a little bit, simplifying it, very much like what we do with children, we adjust the protocol. Anna Gomez has done a great job on that, simplifying the protocol for children. By doing that, we really can minimize the need for a lot of words. And then simply looking at the distress scale every time you go back to the picture, well, what's the disturbance? And inevitably the disturbance comes down. I know I've read a little bit on some of the cross-cultural articles in using EMDR and adjusting the protocol to different settings. And one of the things that does come up is that sometimes we have to, in different cultures, not focus so much on positive cognition, an individual's positive cognition. Because in some cultures, that's not really considered appropriate to have a positive personal ego image of oneself. We value that highly in our Western society, but that's not often valued. And in those settings, what we would do is we would get the person to value their role in the social group rather than themselves or what they believe about themselves, but what they believe about how they're doing in their role, for example, a mother, a father, a teacher, a skills craftsperson, or so on. We may have to adjust the idea of cognitions to not so much look at a personal, my personal belief in my own, they may be much more tribal, much more community oriented. The concept of self is tied to the society rather than the individual. So I think in those areas, if we adjust the protocol and tweak it a bit, I think we pretty much could apply these methods of healing for trauma pretty much universally across cultures. And it can be done pretty simply and pretty efficiently. I believe that EMDR, it's one of the few therapies that actually uses the word healing. And if you think about therapy in a universal and a cross-cultural way, when we leave the industrial nations and the Eurocentric view, all of a sudden we see indigenous practices emerging everywhere, and it's seen more as a natural part of healing and ritual. EMDR is one of the only psychotherapies that I know that's actually boldly embraced the word healing. Most psychotherapy is seen as palliative, ameliorates chronic conditions. It's not seen as a healing method in and of itself. And in that way, I think EMDR fits very well with indigenous practices. It matches them very, very well and can easily be kind of moved into the cultural format. Here in Hawaii, in many of our trainings, when we've been involved in training local practitioners, they've automatically begun to incorporate various indigenous methods into the EMDR practice. For example, the use of drums and snares and simple handmade musical instruments for use instead of the eye movement, the dual attention stimuli. So many Native practitioners simply use those simple methods. Rocking, moving, tapping, holding a hand, a finger, a gentle holding of a hand, and the movement of just touching someone's hand could do the dual attention stimuli. So you wouldn't even have to even use the eye movement part of EMDR if you didn't want to. And there may be certain cultural settings where that actually is prohibited. It would be looked at as sort of disturbing. I think one of the other reasons why EMDR may be more accessible to a broader cultural grouping is that if we think about all psychotherapies, we probably could divide them simply by describing those which are top-down and those which are bottom-up. And what I mean by that is The top-down therapies are those therapies that really are more cognitive, that are about thinking. When we think about our Hawaiian culture, for example, the brain is not considered the main source of the self. The heart and the gut are actually considered the main source of the self. So to be thought-oriented actually isn't it wouldn't be really seen as the best way to approach the healing of the self. You would go through the heart and the gut. So EMDR, I think, is uniquely positioned in that it can go from either top to down or bottom to up. You can enter the nervous system either somatically, very much like bottom-up therapies, or for people who are more top-down and cognitive, you can approach it through the cognitions as a top-down therapy. But it kind of comes in the middle and can go either way, from a bottom-up or top-down. I think the other thing about EMDR that makes it a more universal and a naturally cross-cultural form of treatment is that it's easy to implement. It's easy to implement. A lot of psychotherapies require a lot of theory and require a lot of psychoeducation in the very thinking structure of the therapy. And that can be cumbersome and difficult to implement. Where EMDR can be implemented really right there with just some very simple things. It doesn't have to have a lot of theory involved in it. Matter of fact, it can be done with very little theory. Very little theory at all. I think if you look at EMDR, there's a lot of indigenous practices that have elements of it that are already there. A lot of it. Indigenous healing practices are very similar to EMDR. So I think in that way also EMDR kind of fits well into that. The other thing is I think it can be trained fairly simply, and I'm not saying that the mastery of it can be simple, but I think it can be trained fairly simply, where some of the other psychotherapies take a lot of years of training. And again, I'm not minimizing the fact that to become very skilled at EMDR may take a significant amount of time and continued training. But the structure in which it's been trained is pretty simple and doable. I mean, when the average basic training is roughly 6 days, broken up into, 2 3-day modules. Sometimes it's adjusted a little, 3.5 or whatever days, with a practice period in between. That's a fairly simple and doable structure for training, and it's so systematic that it can be replicated over and over and over, so that it's pretty easy to design the method of training the use of EMDR. So I think it's very, very practical. So as a cross-cultural 21st century form of mental health healing, I think it has a lot of possibilities for being both universal and also being made available in the 21st century, with the emerging global needs and trauma becoming kind of something that is being felt everywhere and is being experienced everywhere. So that's kind of my wrap-up. It's a short one today. It's my wrap-up on EMDR as a universal, cross-cultural, and practicable form of therapy for the 21st century that I believe can be used across wide groupings of peoples. So again, I want to thank everybody for attending our weekly peer review, and this is the end of this particular series on EMDR as part of trauma-informed and capable care. But we're going to be back with a whole other different sets of series on different types of treatments that are used in trauma on behalf of the Greenville Conservancy. So we'll see you again.